The cry in the barn. Caleb Rowan heard the scream before he saw the girl. A sound so broken it didn't seem human anymore, rising from the collapsed roof of an abandoned barn where no child should have been. Inside, 3 men stood over a shaking 13-year-old, and one of them held a signed contract claiming her as payment for debt. This was Montana Territory, 1882, where a man's word could still be law, and where one choice would either save a life or end his own. If you want to see how far one man will go when the law looks the other way, stay with me until the end. And if this story reaches you, drop a comment with your city so I can see how far Lila's voice has traveled. The storm had passed through the high country like a fist, leaving the sky bruised and the ground slick with mud that smelled of iron and sage. Caleb Rowan rode his fence line alone, the way he'd ridden it for the better part of 10 years, checking for breaks, counting losses, keeping his head down and his business his own. The wind still had teeth in it, cutting across the open range and biting through his coat. His horse, a steady roan mare named Dust, picked her way carefully over the uneven ground, ears flicking at every sound. He wasn't looking for trouble. He never was. But trouble had a way of finding a man anyway. The sound came first as a whisper beneath the wind. A voice, thin and high, carried on the tail end of a gust. Caleb pulled up short, his hand going still on the reins. Dust shifted beneath him, uneasy. He listened, head tilted, eyes narrowing against the gray light. There it was again. Not the wind, not an animal, a scream. He turned Dust toward the old Haverhill barn, a sagging wreck of timber and rot that hadn't been used in years, not since the family that owned it had packed up and left for California. The roof had caved in on one side, and the doors hung crooked on their hinges. No one had business being there, especially not in the aftermath of a storm. Caleb dismounted 50 yards out, tying Dust to a cottonwood and moving forward on foot. His boots squelched in the mud. His breath came steady, controlled. He'd learned a long time ago not to rush into anything blind. The closer he got, the clearer the sound became. A girl's voice, broken and pleading, and beneath it, the low rumble of men's voices, hard and indifferent. He reached the barn and pressed himself against the warped wood siding, peering through a gap in the boards. Inside, 3 men stood in a loose half circle. 2 of them were hired muscle, the kind you could find in any saloon if you had enough coin and not enough conscience. Thick-shouldered, unshaven, hands resting easy on their gun belts. The 3rd man was different, older, well-dressed in a wool coat and polished boots, holding himself with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. And on the ground between them, trembling and filthy, was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 13. Her dress was torn at the sleeve, caked with mud and straw. Her dark hair hung loose and tangled around a face that was pale with terror. Her hands were bound in front of her with rough twine, and her knees were pulled up to her chest like she was trying to make herself disappear. The well-dressed man was talking, his voice smooth and measured, like he was discussing the price of cattle. "Your father signed the contract, girl. You understand what that means, don't you? You belong to me now, legal and proper." The girl shook her head, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Please, please, I'll work. I'll do anything. Just don't—" "You'll do what you're told," the man interrupted, his tone sharpening. "And you'll do it without making this harder than it needs to be." One of the hired men stepped forward, reaching down to grab her arm. Caleb moved. He didn't think about it, didn't weigh the odds or consider the consequences. He just moved. The barn door screeched as he shoved it open, the sound cutting through the space like a blade. All 3 men turned, hands going to their weapons. Caleb stepped inside, his own hand resting calm and easy on the grip of his Colt, his eyes locked on the well-dressed man. "Step away from her." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. The well-dressed man recovered first, his expression shifting from surprise to irritation. "This is private business, friend. I suggest you turn around and forget you saw anything." Caleb didn't move. "I suggest you take your men and get out of here before this becomes something you can't walk away from." One of the hired men laughed, a low, ugly sound. "You got any idea who you're talking to, cowboy?" "Don't much care," Caleb said flatly. The well-dressed man's eyes narrowed. He studied Caleb for a long moment, then gestured to one of his men. "Show him the contract." The hired man pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat and held it up, though he didn't offer it over. Caleb didn't need to see it up close. He knew what it was. He'd seen enough crooked deals in his time to recognize one from 20 paces. Legal and binding, the well-dressed man said. Signed by her father, witnessed and notarized. The girl is payment for a debt he couldn't settle. Everything here is above board. Caleb's jaw tightened. A girl's not property. According to the law, she is if her guardian says so. The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. Now, I've been patient, but my patience has limits. Caleb looked past him, down at the girl on the floor. Her eyes were wide and wet, fixed on him like he was the only thing standing between her and the dark. She didn't say anything, didn't beg, but the look in her eyes said everything. He made his choice. She's leaving with me. The temperature in the barn dropped 10 degrees. The well-dressed man's smile vanished. You're making a mistake. Wouldn't be the first time. The two hired men moved apart, flanking him. Caleb didn't draw his gun, but his hand stayed where it was, steady and ready. The air hummed with the promise of violence, taut as a wire about to snap. You pull that iron, Caleb said quietly, and you better be ready to use it, because I will. For a moment no one moved, no one breathed. Then the well-dressed man raised a hand, stopping his men. He looked at Caleb with something close to amusement, though there was nothing warm in it. You don't know who you're crossing, Rowan. Caleb's eyes flickered. The man knew his name. That meant this wasn't random. That meant he'd been watched, measured, maybe even planned for. None of that mattered now. I know exactly what I'm doing, Caleb said. The man's expression hardened. Then you're a fool. He turned to his men. Let him have her, for now. The hired men hesitated, then stepped back. The well-dressed man walked past Caleb without another word, his boots clicking against the barn floor. At the door he paused and looked back. This isn't over. No, Caleb agreed. I don't expect it is. The men left, and the barn fell silent except for the sound of the girl's ragged breathing. Caleb holstered his gun and crossed to her, kneeling down slow so as not to spook her. She flinched when he reached for the twine around her wrists, but she didn't pull away. He cut the bindings with his knife, careful not to nick her skin, and tucked the blade back into his belt. You're safe now, he said quietly. She stared at him, her lips trembling. They'll come back. I know. They'll kill you. Caleb stood and offered her his hand. Maybe, but not today. She looked at his hand for a long moment, then took it. Her fingers were cold and small, and they shook as he helped her to her feet. She swayed, unsteady, and he steadied her with a hand on her shoulder. What's your name? He asked. Lila, she whispered. Lila Hart. I'm Caleb. You know where you are, Lila? She nodded. The Haverhill place. My father. He brought me here. Caleb's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice even. He's not here now. Just you and me. He sold me, she said, and the words came out hollow, like she still couldn't believe them. He said he didn't have a choice, said the debt was too big. Caleb didn't know what to say to that, didn't know if there was anything that could be said. So he just nodded and led her toward the door. Outside, the world was gray and cold, the sky heavy with the promise of more rain. Dust stood where he'd left her, ears pricked forward, watching them approach. Caleb untied the reins and turned to Lila. Can you ride? She shook her head. All right, you'll ride with me. He swung up into the saddle and reached down, pulling her up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist and pressed her face against his back, and he felt her shaking, whether from cold or fear or both, he didn't know. He turned Dust toward home and rode without looking back. The ranch sat in a shallow valley, sheltered by hills on three sides and bordered by a creek that ran clear and cold even in the driest months. It wasn't much, a cabin, a barn, a handful of outbuildings, but it was his, and it was far enough from town that a man could live without interference. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and steady, and the animals stirred in the barn as they approached. Caleb dismounted and helped Lila down. She stood unsteady on the ground, her eyes taking in the place with a kind of wary disbelief, like she wasn't sure if it was real. Come on inside, Caleb said. You need to warm up. The cabin was small but solid. A single room with a stone fireplace, a table, 2 chairs, a cot in the corner. Much in the way of comfort, but it was clean and dry and warm. Caleb stoked the fire and added another log, then pulled out a chair for her. Sit. She sat, moving slow and mechanical, like her body wasn't quite obeying her mind. Caleb filled a kettle from the water barrel and hung it over the fire, then rummaged through his stores until he found a tin of beans and some hardtack. He set them on the table in front of her. Eat. She stared at the food like she didn't know what to do with it. Go on, he said, softer this time. You're safe here. She picked up a piece of hardtack and bit into it, chewing slowly, then faster. Then she was eating with both hands, tears streaming down her face, and Caleb turned away to give her privacy. When the kettle boiled, he poured her a cup of weak tea and set it beside her. She drank it in gulps, not caring that it burned. He waited until she was done, then sat down across from her. Tell me what happened, he said. She looked down at the table, her hands wrapped around the empty cup. My father, he borrowed money, a lot of it, from a man named Garrett Voss. He said it was for the farm, to get us through the winter, but the harvest failed, and then the debt came due, and Voss wanted payment. She nodded. He came to the house, told my father he could have more time, if he gave him me. Her voice cracked. And my father said yes. Caleb's hands tightened into fists on the table. He said he didn't have a choice, Lila continued, her voice barely above a whisper. He said it was the only way, that Voss would take care of me, that it was better than the alternative. There's always a choice, Caleb said, his voice low and hard. She looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen. What are you going to do? Keep you safe. They'll come for me. I know. They'll hurt you. Let them try. She stared at him, searching his face for something, reassurance maybe, or proof that he meant what he said. Whatever she found, it was enough. She nodded, just once, and looked away. Why? She asked quietly. Why are you doing this? Caleb was silent for a long moment. He thought about all the things he could say, all the reasons he could give. But in the end, the truth was simpler than that. Because it's right. The first night passed without incident. Caleb gave Lila the cot and took the floor, his gun within arm's reach. She didn't sleep much. He could hear her shifting, listening to the wind and the creak of the cabin and the sound of her trying not to cry, and he wondered if he'd just signed his own death warrant. Probably. But he'd made his choice, and he'd stand by it. Morning came gray and cold. Caleb rose before dawn, stoked the fire, and put on coffee. Lila was awake when he turned around, sitting on the edge of the cot, watching him. Morning, he said. Morning, she echoed, her voice small. He poured her a cup of coffee and handed it over. She took it with both hands, holding it like it was something precious. You know how to work a ranch? He asked. She shook her head. You're going to learn. Can't have you sitting idle. Idle hands make for restless minds. She nodded, a flicker of something, relief, maybe, crossing her face. They spent the morning in the barn. Caleb showed her how to feed the horses, how to muck the stalls, how to check the animals for injury or illness. She was clumsy at first, unsure, but she listened and she learned, and by midday she was moving with a little more confidence. They were mending a section of fence when Caleb saw the rider. He straightened, his hand going instinctively to his gun. Lila saw the movement and went still, her eyes wide. Go to the cabin, Caleb said quietly. Bar the door. Don't come out until I tell you. Caleb, go. She ran. Caleb watched the rider approach, his hand resting easy on his colt. The man was alone, riding a tall black horse, dressed in a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat. As he got closer, Caleb recognized him. Sheriff Tom Briggs. Caleb relaxed, but only slightly. Briggs reined in a few yards away and tipped his hat. Caleb. Tom. The sheriff dismounted and walked over, his eyes flicking toward the cabin. Heard you had some excitement yesterday. Word travels fast. It does when Garrett Voss is involved. Briggs hooked his thumbs in his belt, his expression unreadable. He came to see me this morning. Says you stole property from him. Property, Caleb repeated, his voice flat. His words, not mine. Briggs sighed. He's got a contract, Caleb. Signed and notarized. Says the girl's father handed her over in payment for debt. And you believe that? Doesn't matter what I believe. It's legal. Legal doesn't make it right. Briggs looked at him for a long moment, then shook his head. You know I agree with you, but the law's the law, and Voss has it on his side. Then the law's broken. Maybe. But breaking it back won't fix anything. It'll just get you killed. Caleb met his eyes, steady and unflinching. I'm not giving her back, Tom. The sheriff exhaled slowly, looking up at the sky like he was searching for answers there. You're putting me in a hell of a spot, Caleb. I know. Voss wants her back. He's not going to let this go. I know that too. Briggs looked toward the cabin again, then back at Caleb. How old is she? 13. The sheriff's jaw tightened. He was quiet for a long time, and when he spoke again, his voice was low. I'll do what I can to slow him down, but I can't protect you if he comes with men and guns. You understand that? I do. Briggs nodded, then turned and walked back to his horse. He swung up into the saddle and looked down at Caleb one last time. Watch your back, Caleb. Voss doesn't forgive, and he doesn't forget. Neither do I. The sheriff rode off, and Caleb stood there watching until he disappeared over the ridge. Then he turned and walked back to the cabin. Lila was standing just inside the door, her face pale. What did he say? She asked. That we're running out of time. She looked down, her hands twisting together. I should go. I should turn myself in. It's not worth... No, Caleb said, his voice firm. You're not going anywhere. But you're not property, Lila. You're a person, and no piece of paper changes that. She stared at him, her eyes filling with tears. Why are you doing this? Because someone has to, he said. 3 days passed. Caleb worked the ranch, keeping Lila close, teaching her the rhythms of the land. She learned quickly, her hands growing steadier, her voice a little stronger. At night they sat by the fire, and sometimes she talked about her mother who died 2 years ago, about the farm, about the life she'd had before everything fell apart. Caleb listened. He didn't offer comfort or empty promises. He just listened. On the 4th day, they came. Caleb was in the barn when he heard the horses. He stepped outside and saw them, 6 riders, moving slow and deliberate across the valley. Garrett Voss rode at the front, flanked by his hired guns. Caleb walked to the cabin and opened the door. Lila was inside, mending a shirt by the window. She looked up, saw his face, and went pale. They're here, he said. She stood, her hands shaking. What do we do? You stay inside. No matter what happens, you stay inside. Caleb, do you trust me? She hesitated, then nodded. Then trust me now. He closed the door and walked out to meet them. The riders stopped 20 yards from the cabin, spreading out in a loose line. Voss dismounted and stepped forward, his expression cold and confident. Caleb Rowan, he said, his voice carrying across the yard. You've had your fun. Now it's time to be reasonable. I'm done being reasonable, Caleb said. Voss smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Then you're a dead man. Caleb's hand rested on his gun. Maybe, but I won't die alone. The hired guns shifted in their saddles, hands drifting toward their weapons. The air crackled with tension, sharp and electric. And then, from the ridge behind them, came the sound of hoofbeats. Everyone turned. Sheriff Briggs rode into view, flanked by 2 deputies. He reined in at the edge of the yard, his hand resting easy on his rifle. That's far enough, Voss, Briggs called out. Voss's smile faltered. This is none of your concern, Sheriff. A man threatening another man on his own land? That's my concern. I have a legal contract. I've seen your contract, Briggs interrupted, and I've had a long talk with Judge Carver about it. Turns out, selling a minor into servitude is illegal, even with a signature. Voss's face darkened. You're overstepping, Briggs. No, I'm doing my job. The sheriff's voice hardened. Now you and your men are going to turn around and ride out of here. And if I see you near this ranch again, I'll arrest you for attempted kidnapping. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. Then Voss turned and horse. He looked down at Caleb, his eyes cold with promise. This isn't over. I know, Caleb said. Voss and his men rode off, and the yard fell silent. Briggs dismounted and walked over to Caleb, his expression tired. You're lucky I like you, Caleb. I know that too. The sheriff glanced at the cabin. The girl all right? She will be. Briggs nodded. Judge Carver's going to want to see her. Make sure she's placed somewhere safe. She's safe here. Briggs studied him for a moment, then sighed. We'll talk about it. But for now, you've got some breathing room. He tipped his hat and rode off with his deputies, leaving Caleb standing alone in the yard. The door to the cabin opened and Lila stepped out. She looked at him, her eyes wide and uncertain. Is it over? She asked. Caleb looked toward the horizon, where Voss and his men had disappeared. No, he said quietly. But we won. For today, at least. Itself was holding its breath. Caleb went about his work with the same steady rhythm he always had, mending fence, checking the herd, hauling water from the creek. But now there was a second shadow that followed him. Lila stayed close, learning the shape of the ranch, the routines that marked one day from the next. She didn't speak much, but her presence filled the silence in ways he hadn't expected. She learned to carry buckets without spilling, to scatter feed for the chickens, to recognize when a horse was favoring a leg. Her hands, soft and unused to labor when she'd arrived, began to roughen and callous. She didn't complain. She just worked, her eyes watchful, her movements deliberate, like she was afraid that if she stopped moving, she might disappear. Caleb watched her without saying much. He saw the way she startled at sudden sounds, the way her gaze drifted toward the horizon whenever hoofbeats echoed in the distance. Fear had settled into her bones, and he knew it would take more than a few days of safety to coax it out. On the 6th morning, she was in the barn brushing down dust when he came in with a coil of rope over his shoulder. She looked up, her hand stilling on the mare's flank. Caleb? Yeah? What happens if they come back? He set the rope down and leaned against the stall door, his arms crossed. Then we deal with it. How? Same way we dealt with it before. She looked down at the brush in her hand, turning it over slowly. The sheriff won't always be there. I know. And you can't fight all of them. Probably not. Her eyes lifted to his, dark and serious. Then why are you keeping me here? Caleb was quiet for a moment, weighing his words. Because running would just put you somewhere else where someone else could do the same thing. And because I don't run. Even if it cost you everything? Even then. She didn't say anything after that, but she went back to brushing the horse, and there was something different in her posture, something a little less hunched, a little less afraid. That afternoon, Caleb rode into town. He didn't tell Lila where he was going, just left her with instructions to stay inside and keep the rifle by the door. She nodded, her face pale but determined, and he rode out before he could second-guess himself. The town of Shepherd's Hollow sat at the base of the mountains, a scattering of wooden buildings and dirt streets that turned to mud when it rained. It wasn't much, but it was the only place for 50 miles where a man could buy supplies, settle debts, or find trouble if he went looking for it. Caleb wasn't looking for trouble, but he knew it might find him anyway. He tied dust outside the general store and went inside. The place smelled of sawdust and tobacco, the shelves stocked with canned goods, flour, bolts of fabric, and ammunition. The owner, a stout man named Harlan with a gray beard and suspicious eyes, looked up from behind the counter. Caleb, Harlan, heard you've been making enemies. Caleb pulled a list from his pocket and set it on the counter. I need these. Harlan glanced at the list, then back at Caleb. Voss came through here yesterday, said you stole something that belongs to him. He's a liar. Maybe, but he's got money and lawyers. You've got neither. I've got what I need. Harlan snorted and started pulling items from the shelves. Coffee, beans, flour, salt. He worked in silence for a while, then paused and looked at Caleb square. That girl he's talking about, she really just a kid? 13. Harlan's jaw worked, his hand stilling on a sack of flour. That's a damn shame. Yeah. You really think you can keep her safe? I'm going to try. Harlan nodded slowly, then added an extra tin of peaches to the pile without charging for it. You'll need all the help you can get. Caleb paid for the supplies and loaded them onto Dust. As he was tying down the last bundle, a voice called out from across the street. Rowan! He turned. Garrett Voss stood on the boardwalk in front of the saloon, flanked by two of his men. He was dressed in a fine coat and polished boots, his hat tilted back just enough to show the cold calculation in his eyes. Caleb didn't move. Voss stepped down into the street, his boots clicking against the packed dirt. You cost me a lot of money, Rowan. Good. Voss's smile was thin and dangerous. You think the sheriff can protect you forever? I think the sheriff's doing his job. The law has loopholes, and I know every one of them. Caleb's hand rested easy on his gun belt, his expression flat. You come near my land again, and you'll find out how many loopholes a bullet can make. Voss's eyes glittered. Is that a threat? It's a promise. For a moment, the street went silent. A few townspeople had stopped to watch, standing in doorways and on porches, their faces curious and wary. Voss glanced around, aware of the audience, then stepped back with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You're a dead man, Rowan. You just don't know it yet. I'll take my chances. Voss turned and walked back to the saloon, his men following. Caleb mounted Dust and rode out of town without looking back. By the time he reached the ranch, the sun was low on the horizon, painting the hills in shades of gold and rust. Lila was sitting on the porch steps, the rifle across her lap, her eyes fixed on the road. When she saw him, she stood, her shoulders sagging with relief. You're back. I'm back. She helped him unload the supplies, carrying them inside in silence. When everything was put away, she stood by the table, her hands folded in front of her. You saw him, didn't you? Caleb didn't need to ask who she meant. Yeah. What did he say? Nothing worth repeating. She looked down. He's not going to stop. No, he's not. Then what do we do? Caleb poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table. We keep living. We keep working. We don't give him the satisfaction of running scared. Lila sat down across from him, her eyes searching his face. You're not scared at all, are you? I didn't say that. But you're not running. No. Why not? Caleb took a sip of coffee, the heat of it grounding him. Because running doesn't solve anything. It just moves the problem somewhere else. And I'm tired of moving. She was quiet for a long time, her fingers tracing patterns on the worn wood of the table. My father ran, she said finally. From everything, from debts, from responsibility, from me. And it didn't save him. It just made him weaker. You're not your father. How do you know? Because you're still here. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I don't know how to be strong. You're already stronger than you think. A tear slipped down her cheek and she wiped it away quickly. I'm afraid all the time. So am I. That surprised her. You are? Every day. But fear doesn't mean you're weak. It just means you're alive. She nodded slowly, and something in her expression shifted, something small but important. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening land. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For not giving up on me. Caleb didn't answer. He just sat there in the quiet, listening to the fire crackle, and the wind move through the eaves, and he thought about all the things he'd lost, and all the things he still had left to lose. But he didn't move. He just stayed. That night, Lila slept without crying, and Caleb took it as a small victory. The next week passed without incident, but the tension never left. It hung in the air like smoke, invisible but ever present. Caleb kept his rifle close and his eyes on the road. Lila grew quieter, more watchful, like she was bracing for impact. On the 8th day, Sheriff Briggs came back. He rode in slow, his hat pulled low against the wind, his face grim. Caleb met him in the yard, his gut tightening. Tom. Caleb. Briggs dismounted and tied his horse to the post. We need to talk. They walked to the porch, and Briggs sat down on the steps with a heavy sigh. Caleb remained standing, his arms crossed. What is it? Briggs rubbed a hand over his face. Voss filed a lawsuit. He's taking you to court. Caleb's jaw tightened. On what grounds? Theft of property, interference with a legal contract. She's not property. I know that. You know that. But the judge is going to look at that contract and he's going to have to decide whether it's legal or not. And if he decides it is, Briggs met his eyes. Then you'll have to give her back. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Caleb turned away, staring out at the hills. When's the hearing? 2 weeks? Can we win? Briggs was quiet for a long moment. I don't know. Voss has money. He's got lawyers, and the law's on his side, at least on paper. What about what's right? Right doesn't always win in court, Caleb. You know that. Caleb's hands curled into fists. So what do I do? You fight, you get a lawyer, you make your case, and you hope the judge has a conscience. Briggs stood and put a hand on Caleb's shoulder. And if it goes south, you think real hard about what you're willing to lose. Caleb looked at him. I'm not giving her back. Then you better be ready for what comes next. Briggs rode off, and Caleb stood there in the fading light, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. Inside, Lila was waiting. She'd heard everything. They're going to make me go back, she said, her voice hollow. No. The judge, I don't care what the judge says. You're not going back. She looked at him, her face pale and scared. But if the law says, then the law's wrong. Caleb crossed to her, kneeling down so they were eye to eye. You listen to me, Lila. I made you a promise, and I keep my promises. Even if it destroys you? Even then. She broke down, her hands covering her face, her body shaking with sobs. Caleb didn't touch her, didn't try to comfort her with empty words. He just stayed there, close and steady, until the storm passed. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red but clear. What do we do now? We get ready to fight. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. Caleb rode into town and found a lawyer, a young man named Daniel Marsh, who'd just hung his shingle and was hungry enough to take a case no one else would touch. Marsh was idealistic and nervous, but he had fire in his eyes, and that was enough. They met in the lawyer's cramped office, the air thick with the smell of ink and paper. Marsh listened to the whole story, his pen scratching across a notepad, his brow furrowed in concentration. This is going to be difficult, Marsh said when Caleb finished. The contract is legal on its face. To invalidate it, we'll have to prove coercion or argue that it violates public policy. Can we do that? Maybe. If we can get Lila's father to testify. Caleb's expression darkened. He's the one who sold her. I know. But if he admits he was coerced, or if he recants the contract, it weakens Voss's case. And if he doesn't? Marsh hesitated. Then we're relying on the judge's sense of morality, and that's a gamble. Caleb stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street. Find the father. Do whatever you have to do. But we're not losing this. Marsh nodded. I'll do my best. Caleb left the office and rode back to the ranch, his mind churning. He didn't trust Lila's father. Didn't trust any man who'd sell his own child to save his skin. But if there was even a chance he could be convinced to do the right thing, it was worth trying. That night, he told Lila what the lawyer had said. She sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her face unreadable. You want to bring my father to court. If he'll testify, it could help. He won't. You don't know that. She looked up at him, her eyes hard. I know him. He won't risk himself for me. He never has. Caleb didn't argue. He could see the truth of it in her face, the resignation that came from years of disappointment. Then we'll do it without him, he said. She nodded, but there was no hope in her eyes. The hearing was set for a Tuesday morning in the territorial courthouse, a squat stone building that sat at the edge of town like a monument to justice that didn't always deliver. Caleb and Lila arrived early, riding in together under a sky that threatened rain. Marsh met them at the door, his face pale but determined. Are you ready? He asked. Caleb looked down at Lila. She was dressed in a simple gray dress that one of the town women had donated, her hair pulled back in a neat braid. She looked small and fragile, but her eyes were steady. We're ready, Caleb said. Inside, the courtroom was sparse and utilitarian. Wooden benches, a judge's bench at the front, a small table for each side. Garrett Voss was already there, seated with his lawyer, a sharp-eyed man in an expensive suit. Voss looked calm and confident, like he'd already won. The judge entered, and everyone stood. Judge Harold Carver was an older man with white hair and a face carved from granite. He'd been on the bench for 20 years, and he had a reputation for being fair, but uncompromising. "Be seated," Carver said, his voice gravelly. The hearing began. Voss's lawyer went first, presenting the contract and arguing that it was a legally binding agreement between two parties. He was smooth and persuasive, citing precedent and statute, painting Caleb as a vigilante who'd overstepped his bounds. When it was Marsh's turn, he stood and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, this case isn't about contract law. It's about whether a child can be sold like livestock. The plaintiff's claim rests on a document that treats a 13-year-old girl as property, which violates every principle of human decency and public policy." Voss's lawyer objected. "The contract is legal under territorial law." "Legal doesn't make it right," Marsh shot back. Judge Carver held up a hand. "I'll hear testimony. Call your first witness." Marsh called Lila. She walked to the front of the room, her steps slow and measured. She took the stand and was sworn in, her voice barely above a whisper. Marsh approached her gently. "Lila, can you tell the court what happened the day you were taken to the barn?" She looked down at her hands. "My father, he told me we were going to talk to Mr. Voss, that he had a solution to our debt. But when we got there, Mr. Voss said I was the solution. He said I belonged to him now." "Did you agree to this?" "No." "Did your father ask your consent?" "No." Marsh nodded. "What happened next?" "My father left, and Mr. Voss's men tied me up and left me in the barn. I thought—" Her voice broke. "I thought no one was coming." The courtroom was silent. Voss's lawyer stood. "Objection. This is an emotional appeal, not evidence." Judge Carver's eyes narrowed. "Overruled. Continue." Marsh asked a few more questions, then yielded. Voss's lawyer cross-examined, trying to shake her testimony, but Lila held firm. When she was finally dismissed, she walked back to her seat beside Caleb, her face pale but resolute. Marsh called Caleb next. Caleb took the stand and told his side, finding Lila in the barn, confronting Voss, bringing her home. He spoke plainly, without embellishment, and when Voss's lawyer tried to paint him as a criminal, he didn't flinch. "I did what any decent person would do," Caleb said. "I stopped a child from being sold." "You broke the law," the lawyer countered. "Then the law needs to be broken." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Carver banged his gavel. When the testimony was done, both sides gave closing arguments. Voss's lawyer was polished and confident. Marsh was passionate and raw. Then the judge spoke. "I've heard enough," Carver said. "This court will take a short recess to consider the evidence." He disappeared into his chambers, and the room fell into anxious silence. 20 minutes later, he returned. "I've made my decision," Judge Carver said, his voice cutting through the tension. "The contract presented by Mr. Voss, while bearing the appearance of legality, represents a transaction that this court cannot and will not enforce. A child is not chattel. A signature does not grant ownership of a human life. The contract is void." Voss shot to his feet. "Your Honor." "Sit down, Mr. Voss," Carver said sharply. "Furthermore, this court finds that your actions constitute attempted exploitation of a minor. You're fortunate I'm not charging you criminally." He turned to Caleb. "Mr. Rowan, the girl will remain in your custody pending further review by the Territorial Child Welfare Office. This hearing is adjourned." The gavel fell. For a moment, no one moved. Then Lila turned to Caleb, her eyes wide and disbelieving, and he nodded. "It's over," he said quietly. She collapsed against him, sobbing, and he held her steady. Across the room, Voss stood frozen, his face twisted with rage. His eyes locked on Caleb, and the promise in them was clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But for now, they'd won. And that was enough. They rode back to the ranch in silence, the weight of the victory settling over them like dust after a storm. Lila sat behind Caleb on dust, her arms wrapped tight around his waist, her face pressed against his back. He could feel her trembling, not from cold, but from the slow release of tension that had been coiled inside her for weeks. The sky overhead was gray and heavy, threatening rain that never quite fell. and the wind carried the smell of sage and distant water. Caleb kept his eyes on the horizon, scanning the ridges and the tree line out of habit. The judge's ruling had been clear, but he knew Garrett Voss well enough to understand that paper and law meant nothing to a man who'd built his empire on breaking both. The threat in Voss's eyes had been real, and Caleb had learned a long time ago not to ignore a man's eyes when they promised violence. When they reached the ranch, Lila slid down from the horse and stood in the yard, looking around like she was seeing the place for the first time. The cabin, the barn, the fence line stretching out toward the hills. It all looked different now, somehow more solid, more permanent. "Is it really over?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. Caleb dismounted and led Dust toward the barn. "The hearing's over, but Voss won't let it go." "What will he do?" "I don't know yet, but we'll be ready." She followed him into the barn, watching as he unsaddled the mare and brushed her down. Her hands twisted together, and after a moment she spoke again. "What happens to me now?" Caleb paused, the brush stilling in his hand. "The judge said you'd stay here until the territorial office makes a decision. And if they decide I can't, then we'll figure something else out." "You can't fight everyone forever, Caleb." He turned to look at her, his expression steady. "I can try." She shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "You shouldn't have to. None of this is your responsibility." "Maybe not, but it is now." She looked down, her shoulders sagging. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me. You just need to keep going." She nodded, wiping at her eyes, and together they finished the evening chores in companionable silence. When the work was done, they went inside, and Caleb built up the fire while Lila set about making supper. She'd learned enough in the past weeks to handle the basics: beans and salt pork, biscuits from the sourdough starter, coffee strong enough to strip paint. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot and filling, and they ate without talking, each lost in their own thoughts. After supper, Lila sat by the fire with a book Caleb had given her, a worn copy of Ivanhoe that had belonged to his mother. She read slowly, her lips moving over the unfamiliar words, her brow furrowed in concentration. Caleb sat at the table cleaning his rifle, the familiar motions calming his restless mind. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and moaning through the eaves. Caleb set the rifle aside and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain to look out into the darkness. The night was thick and moonless, the kind of dark that swallowed sound and made every shadow a threat. "You think they'll come tonight?" Lila asked from behind him. "No. Voss is smart. He'll wait until we relax, until we think it's safe." "Then we'll never be safe." "Not until he's dealt with." She set the book down and came to stand beside him, her arms wrapped around herself. "How do you live like this? Always waiting for something bad to happen?" Caleb let the curtain fall and turned to face her. "You get used to it." "I don't want to get used to it." "Then you fight until you don't have to anymore." She looked up at him, searching his face for something. Reassurance, maybe, or hope. Whatever she found, it seemed to be enough. She nodded and went back to her chair, picking up the book again, and Caleb returned to the table and his rifle. The night passed without incident, but neither of them slept well. The next few days fell into a fragile routine. Caleb worked the ranch, and Lila worked beside him, her confidence growing with each task she mastered. She learned to rope a fence post, to recognize the signs of illness in the cattle, to shoot the old Winchester Caleb had given her for practice. She was a quick learner, her hands steady and her focus sharp, and Caleb found himself relying on her more than he'd expected. But beneath the surface, the tension never left. Every sound made them both look up. Every rider on the distant road made Caleb's hand drift toward his gun. They didn't talk about it, but they both felt it. The unspoken knowledge that the storm wasn't over, just waiting. On the fourth day after the hearing, Sheriff Briggs came again. He rode in just after noon, his face grim and tired. Caleb met him in the yard, his gut tightening at the sight of the sheriff's expression. "Tom." "Caleb." Briggs dismounted slowly, like his bones ached. "We need to talk." They walked to the porch and sat down on the steps. Lila appeared in the doorway, her face pale, but Caleb waved her back inside. "What is it?" Caleb asked. Briggs pulled off his hat and turned it over in his hands. "Voss is making noise, big noise. He's been to the territorial governor's office, filed complaints, called in favors. He's trying to get the judge's ruling overturned. Can he do that? Not easily, but he's got influence, and he's not afraid to use it. Briggs looked at Caleb, his eyes serious. There's more. 2 of his men were seen asking around town about you, about the ranch, about how many people you've got out here. Caleb's jaw tightened. He's planning something. That's what I'm thinking. And I can't protect you if he comes with enough men. I've got 2 deputies and a town to look after. If Voss decides to make a move, you'll be on your own. I've been on my own before. Not like this. Briggs leaned forward, his voice dropping. Caleb, I'm asking you as a friend. Think about getting the girl somewhere safe, somewhere Voss can't reach her. Where would that be? He's got reach all over the territory. Then take her out of the territory. Montana, Idaho, hell, California if you have to. Just get her away from here. Caleb shook his head. Running won't solve this. It'll just delay it. Sometimes delay is enough. Not for me. Briggs sighed and stood, putting his hat back on. Then you better be ready for whatever comes next, because it's coming. He rode off, and Caleb stood on the porch, staring out at the hills. The sky was clear and blue, the air crisp with the promise of autumn, and everything looked peaceful. But he knew better than to trust appearances. Inside, Lila was waiting. She'd heard everything. He wants us to run, she said. Yeah. Are we going to? Caleb looked at her, at the fear and determination warring in her eyes, and he made his choice. No. She nodded, and he saw something shift in her expression, relief, maybe, or resolve. Then what do we do? We get ready. They spent the next 2 days preparing. Caleb reinforced the cabin windows with heavy shutters, stocked extra ammunition, filled barrels with water in case of fire. He taught Lila how to reload the Winchester quickly, how to aim for center mass, how to stay calm under pressure. She listened and practiced, her hands steady on the rifle, her eyes focused. At night, they took turns keeping watch. Caleb would sit by the window with his rifle across his lap, scanning the darkness, while Lila slept fitfully on the cot. Then they'd switch, and she'd sit in the chair, her small frame dwarfed by the weapon in her hands, while Caleb caught a few hours of uneasy rest. It was on the 6th night that they came. Caleb was on watch, sitting in the darkness with only the dying embers of the fire for light. The night was still and cold, the kind of cold that crept into your bones and stayed there. He'd been drifting, his mind wandering, when Dust let out a sharp whinny from the barn. He was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. Lila woke at the movement, her eyes wide in the darkness. "What is it?" she whispered. "Company." He moved to the window and peered out through the gap in the shutters. At first he saw nothing, just the black expanse of the yard and the darker shapes of the barn and outbuildings. Then he caught movement, shadows detaching from shadows, moving slow and deliberate toward the cabin. "How many?" Lila asked, her voice tight. "At least 6, maybe more." She picked up the Winchester and moved to the opposite window, taking up position like he'd taught her. Her hands were shaking, but her jaw was set. Caleb waited, his breathing slow and even, his finger resting light on the trigger. The shadows drew closer, spreading out to surround the cabin. He recognized the tactic. They were trying to box them in, cut off any escape. A voice called out from the darkness, smooth and familiar. "Rowan, I know you're in there. Come out and we can settle this peaceful." Garrett Voss. Caleb didn't answer. He just watched and waited. "I'm offering you one chance," Voss continued. "Send the girl out, and you can walk away from this. No one needs to get hurt." Lila looked at Caleb, her face pale. "What do we do?" "We wait." Voss's voice hardened. "You've got 1 minute, Rowan. Then we come in and take her." Caleb moved to the door and called out through the heavy wood. "She's not going anywhere, Voss. Turn around and ride out while you still can." There was a pause, then Voss laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. "You're a fool, Rowan. You think you can hold off all of us?" "I'm willing to find out. Then you'll die a fool's death." "Maybe, but I won't die alone." The silence that followed was thick and tense. Caleb could feel his heart pounding in his chest, could hear the blood rushing in his ears. Beside him, Lila was breathing hard, her knuckles white on the rifle. Then all hell broke loose. The first shot shattered the window on the east side, glass exploding inward. Caleb dropped to the floor, pulling light. The cabin filled with the deafening crack of gunfire, the air thick with smoke and the smell of powder. Caleb crawled to the window and returned fire, aiming at the muzzle flashes in the darkness. He heard a cry of pain, saw one of the shadows drop. Lila was at the other's window, firing methodically, her face set in grim concentration. "Reload!" Caleb shouted over the noise. She ducked down, her hands moving quickly to chamber another round. A bullet whined past her head, embedding itself in the far wall, but she didn't flinch. She came back up and fired again, and Caleb felt a fierce surge of pride. The attack continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The men outside were well armed and determined, but the cabin was solid and the defenders were ready. Caleb moved from window to window, picking his shots, making each one count. Lila followed his lead, her fear transforming into cold, focused anger. Then, suddenly, the shooting stopped. Caleb held his position, listening. He could hear voices outside, low and urgent, and the sound of horses shifting nervously. He risked a glance through the shutter and saw the shadows pulling back, regrouping. "What are they doing?" Lila whispered, figuring out their next move. "Did we win?" "Not yet." As if in answer, one of the outbuildings erupted in flames. Fire roared up into the night sky, bright and terrible, casting the yard in hellish orange light. Caleb cursed under his breath. They were trying to burn them out. "We need to stop that fire before it spreads," he said. "How?" "I'll go out. You cover me." "Caleb, no." "There's no other way." He checked his ammunition, then looked at her. "You keep firing. Make them think twice about rushing the cabin. Can you do that?" She nodded, her face set. "I can do it." He moved to the door, took a deep breath, and threw it open. The yard was chaos, smoke and fire and the sharp crack of gunfire. Caleb ran low and fast toward the burning building, his rifle up, firing as he moved. Bullets kicked up dirt around his feet, whined past his ears, but he didn't stop. He reached the building, a small storage shed, and saw that it was already too far gone. The flames had taken hold, consuming the dry wood with ravenous hunger. But the barn was close, too close, and if the fire spread there, the horses would be trapped. Caleb grabbed a bucket and ran to the water trough, filling it and throwing the water on the side of the barn nearest the fire. He worked fast, his movements automatic. While behind him, Lila kept up a steady stream of covering fire. He could hear her rifle barking in the night, could hear the curses and shouts of the men as they scattered. He was on his third bucket when a bullet caught him high on the left shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees. Pain exploded through him, white-hot and searing, and for a moment his vision went dark. He heard Lila scream his name, heard her rifle fall silent, and he forced himself to his feet. "Stay inside," he shouted, stumbling back toward the cabin. She was at the door, her face twisted with fear, and she grabbed him as he staggered through, pulling him inside and slamming the door shut. He collapsed against the wall, his shoulders screaming, blood soaking through his shirt. "You're hit," Lila said, her voice shaking. "I noticed." She tore a strip from her dress and pressed it against the wound, her hands slick with his blood. Caleb gritted his teeth against the pain, his breath coming in sharp gasps. "Can you still shoot?" she asked. "Yeah." "Then we keep fighting." He looked at her, this girl who'd been broken and terrified just weeks ago, and saw something fierce and unbreakable in her eyes. He nodded, and together they returned to the windows. The fire had burned itself out, the storage shed reduced to smoking rubble. The men outside had pulled back farther, regrouping again. Caleb could see them in the firelight, shadows among shadows, and he counted at least 5 still standing. "We hurt them," Lila said. Not enough." They waited, the silence stretching out. Caleb's shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, and he could feel blood trickling down his arm. He knew he couldn't keep this up much longer, knew that if they rushed the cabin again, he might not be able to stop them. Then, from the darkness beyond the fire, came the sound of hoofbeats. Multiple horses, moving fast. Caleb tensed, raising his rifle. If Voss had brought reinforcements, they were finished. But the riders that burst into the yard weren't Voss's men. Sheriff Briggs led the charge, flanked by his 2 deputies and 3 men from town. Farmers and ranchers who'd heard about the attack and come to help. They came in hard, guns drawn, and the remaining attackers scattered like leaves before a storm. Voss shouted orders, trying to rally his men, but it was too late. They were outnumbered now, outgunned, and the fight had gone out of them. One by one they mounted their horses and fled into the darkness, Voss riding last, his face twisted with rage. Briggs dismounted and ran to the cabin, pounding on the door. "Caleb, it's Tom! Open up!" Lila threw the door open, and Briggs stepped inside, his eyes taking in the scene. The shattered windows, the bullet holes in the walls, the blood on Caleb's shirt. "You all right?" he asked. "We're alive," Caleb said. Briggs nodded, then turned to his deputies. "Get a doctor out here, and I want men posted on the perimeter. Voss might come back." One of the deputies rode off, and the others began securing the area. Briggs knelt beside Caleb, examining the wound. "You're lucky. Looks like it went clean through." "Doesn't feel lucky." "Never does." Briggs stood and looked at Lila. "You did good, girl. Real good." She didn't answer, just sank down into a chair, the rifle still clutched in her hands, her face pale and streaked with tears. The doctor arrived an hour later, a grizzled old man named Sullivan, who'd seen more gunshot wounds than he cared to count. He cleaned and dressed Caleb's shoulder, muttering about foolish men and their even more foolish choices, then left a bottle of laudanum and instructions to rest. Caleb didn't rest. He sat at the table, his arm in a sling, and talked with Briggs. "Voss won't stop," Caleb said. "I know. But tonight changes things. He attacked you on your own property, tried to burn you out. That's attempted murder. I can arrest him for that. If you can find him..." "I'll find him." Briggs's voice was hard. "And when I do, he's going to answer for this." "What about his influence? His money?" "Money can't buy everything, not when there are witnesses." Briggs gestured to the men standing guard outside. "Half the town saw what he tried to do tonight. That carries weight, even in a crooked system." Caleb wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that justice would finally catch up to Garrett Voss. But he'd lived long enough to know that men like Voss didn't go down easy. Still, he nodded. "Do what you can, Tom." "I will. And in the meantime, you keep your head down and your powder dry." Briggs left with his men, leaving 2 deputies behind to stand watch. Caleb and Lila were finally alone, the cabin quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the sound of their breathing. Lila looked at him, her eyes red and exhausted. "Is it really over now?" Caleb thought about Voss's face as he'd ridden away, the promise of retribution burning in his eyes. He thought about all the ways a man like that could come back, all the angles he could play. "No," he said honestly. "But we won tonight, and that's something." She nodded, then stood and walked to him, wrapping her arms around him in a careful hug that avoided his wounded shoulder. He held her with his good arm, and they stood there in the firelight, 2 battered souls who'd somehow survived the night. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying away the smoke and the smell of gunpowder. The stars began to emerge from behind the clouds, cold and distant and indifferent. But inside the cabin, there was warmth. There was safety. And for now, that was enough. Dawn came cold and gray, the sun hidden behind a wall of clouds that stretched from horizon to horizon. Caleb woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Lila moving quietly around the cabin, trying not to wake him. His shoulder throbbed with a deep, persistent ache that radiated down his arm and up into his neck. And when he tried to sit up, the room tilted sideways for a moment before steadying. Lila appeared beside him, a cup of coffee in her hands. "You should rest." "Can't afford to rest." "The deputies are still outside. We're safe." Caleb took the coffee and sipped it, the bitter heat cutting through the fog in his head. "Safe is relative." She sat down on the edge of the cot, her face serious. "Sheriff Briggs will find Voss. He said so. Briggs is a good man, but Voss is like a snake. You cut off his head and he just grows another one. Then what do we do?" Caleb looked at her, at the determination in her young face, and felt the weight of responsibility settle heavier on his shoulders. "We stay alert, we stay ready, and we don't give him another opening." She nodded and stood, moving back to the stove where she'd been frying salt pork. The cabin still bore the scars of the previous night's attack. Shattered glass swept into a corner, bullet holes in the walls like accusatory eyes, the acrid smell of gunpowder lingering in the air. One of the deputies had nailed boards over the broken windows, but the cabin felt smaller now, more vulnerable. Caleb forced himself to his feet, ignoring the protest from his shoulder, and walked to the door. Outside, the two deputies sat on the porch steps, their rifles across their laps, their eyes scanning the tree line. One of them, a young man named Carson with a wispy mustache and nervous hands, looked up as Caleb emerged. "Morning, Mr. Rowan. How's the shoulder?" "Still attached." Carson smiled weakly. "That's something, I suppose." "Any sign of trouble?" "Quiet as a church. Sheriff's got men out looking for Voss and his crew. Shouldn't be long before they're rounded up." Caleb didn't share the deputy's optimism, but he nodded anyway. "Appreciate you boys staying." "Just doing our job." Caleb went back inside and ate the breakfast Lila had prepared: salt pork, fried potatoes, biscuits. His appetite was gone, replaced by a gnawing anxiety that sat like a stone in his gut, but he forced himself to eat anyway. He'd need his strength for whatever came next. After breakfast, Lila insisted on changing his bandage. She worked carefully, her small hands surprisingly steady as she unwrapped the blood-stained cloth and examined the wound. It was ugly, a ragged hole where the bullet had entered and a larger, messier hole where it had exited, but Sullivan had cleaned it well, and there were no signs of infection yet. "Does it hurt much?" she asked as she applied fresh bandages. "I've had worse." "When?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, his mind drifting back to a different time, a different war. "A long time ago, in a place far from here." She didn't press, just finished wrapping the bandage and tied it off with a neat knot. "There. That should hold." "Thank you." She looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "You would have died for me last night, wouldn't you?" "Didn't come to that." "But you would have." He met her gaze, unflinching. "Yes." "Why?" "Because you're worth it." Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "No one's ever said that to me before." "Then no one's been paying attention." She smiled, a small, fragile thing that broke his heart and mended it at the same time. Then she stood and went back to her chores, and Caleb sat there thinking about all the things he'd lost and all the things he still had left to protect. The morning passed slowly. The deputies changed shifts at noon, two new men arriving to relieve Carson and his partner. They brought news from town. Sheriff Briggs had tracked Voss to an abandoned mining camp in the hills, but by the time he'd gotten there, Voss and his men had already moved on. The sheriff was still searching, but the trail was cold. Caleb listened to the report with a sinking feeling. Voss was smart, experienced, and he knew the territory better than most. He could hide out for weeks, months even, waiting for the right moment to strike again. That afternoon, a rider appeared on the eastern road. Caleb was in the barn, awkwardly mucking stalls one-handed, when Lila came running. "Someone's coming." He dropped the pitchfork and reached for his rifle, wincing as the movement pulled at his shoulder. Together they moved to the front of the cabin, where the deputies were already on their feet, weapons ready. The rider came closer and Caleb recognized him. Daniel Marsh, the young lawyer who'd defended them in court. He was riding hard, his horse lathered with sweat, his face pale and urgent. He pulled up in the yard and dismounted in a rush. "Caleb, thank heaven you're alive. I heard about the attack." "We survived." "I can see that." Marsh's eyes flicked to the bandage on Caleb's shoulder, then to the boarded windows. "I came as soon as I heard. There's something you need to know." "What is it?" Marsh pulled a folded document from his coat pocket and handed it over. "This arrived at my office this morning. It's from the Territorial Child Welfare Office." Caleb unfolded the paper and read it, his jaw tightening with each line. When he finished, he looked up at Marsh, his expression grim. "They're reviewing the judge's decision." "Yes. Voss filed an appeal through his lawyers. He's claiming that the judge overstepped his authority, that the contract should be enforced under territorial law." "Can they overturn the ruling?" Marsh hesitated. "It's possible. Unlikely, given the circumstances, but possible. Especially if Voss can convince the review board that Judge Carver acted on emotion rather than legal precedent." Caleb handed the paper back, his mind racing. "When's the review?" 2 weeks, in the territorial capital." "And if they overturn it?" Then Lila would be legally required to honor the contract. She'd have to go with Voss. Lila had been standing in the doorway, listening. Now she stepped forward, her face white. No, I won't. I'll run first. Running won't help, Marsh said gently. Voss would have the law on his side. He could have you hunted down, brought back by force. Then what do we do? Caleb asked. Marsh took a breath. We need to make sure the review board understands exactly what kind of man Garrett Voss is. We need witnesses, evidence of his character, proof that enforcing this contract would be unconscionable. After what he did last night, his character should be pretty clear. It would be if we can prove he was behind it, but he's clever. He'll claim he wasn't there, that it was just overzealous employees acting on their own. Without hard evidence linking him directly to the attack, it's just your word against his. Caleb's fist clenched. So we're back where we started. Not quite. The attack itself shows a pattern of behavior. If we can find other people he's hurt, other contracts he's forced, we can build a case that goes beyond just Lila's situation. That could take months. We have 2 weeks. It's not much, but it's what we've got. Caleb looked at Lila, saw the fear and determination warring in her eyes, and made his decision. Then we start now. Marsh nodded. I'll begin gathering depositions in town. You should talk to anyone who might have had dealings with Voss. Farmers, ranchers, business owners. Someone out there knows something. After Marsh left, Caleb sat down with Lila at the table. The deputies had returned to their posts outside, giving them privacy. I need to go into town, Caleb said. Talk to people, see what I can find out. I'm coming with you. Lila, I'm not staying here alone. And I'm not hiding anymore. He studied her face, saw the steel beneath the fear, and realized she was right. She'd been through too much to be left behind like a child. All right, but you stay close, and you do exactly what I say. I will. They rode into town the next morning, leaving the deputies to watch the ranch. The ride was tense and watchful, Caleb's eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his good hand never far from his gun. Lila sat behind him, quiet and alert, her small frame pressed against his back. Shepherd's Hollow looked the same as always. Dusty streets, weathered buildings, people going about their business with the kind of weary determination that defined frontier life. But there was a tension in the air now, a sense that something had shifted. People stopped and stared as Caleb and Lila rode past, their faces a mix of curiosity, sympathy, and fear. They stopped first at the general store. Harlan was behind the counter, sorting through a shipment of canned goods. He looked up as they entered, his expression cautious. Caleb, heard you had some trouble. You could say that. Harlan's eyes flicked to Lila, then back to Caleb. The whole town's talking about it. Voss attacking you in your own home. That's low, even for him. I need to know something, Harlan. Has Voss done this before? Forced contracts? Taken things that didn't belong to him? Harlan was quiet for a moment, his hands stilling on the cans. When he spoke, his voice was low. There have been rumors. People losing their land over debts that seemed too convenient. Business owners forced to sell out for pennies on the dollar. Nothing anyone could prove, but enough to make folks nervous. Anyone willing to testify to it? In court? Against Voss? Harlan shook his head. You're asking people to put themselves in his crosshairs. That's a hard thing to do. Someone has to stand up to him. Maybe, but most folks have families to think about, jobs, homes. They can't afford to be heroes. Caleb understood. He understood too well. But understanding didn't make it easier. They talked to a dozen people that day, the blacksmith, the banker, the woman who ran the boarding house. Each one had stories, whispers, suspicions. But when it came down to putting their names on a legal document, they all balked. Fear was a powerful motivator, and Voss had spent years cultivating it. By late afternoon, Caleb and Lila were sitting on a bench outside the saloon, discouraged and tired. Lila looked up at him, her eyes troubled. No one's going to help us, are they? I don't know. They're all too scared. Can't blame them for that. She was quiet for a moment, then spoke again. What about my father? Caleb turned to look at her. What about him? He signed the contract. He knows what Voss is. Maybe if he told the truth about what happened, about how Voss forced him, You think he'd do that? I don't know. But he's the only one who can prove Voss was a broken man, a drunk who'd sold his own daughter to save his worthless hide. But he was also the only witness to the original transaction, the only one who could testify to Voss's methods. You want to see him? Caleb asked. Lila's face tightened. No, but if it's the only way, it might not change anything. He might refuse to help. Or he might surprise us. Caleb doubted it, but he nodded anyway. All right, we'll try. They found Thomas Hart 3 miles outside of town, living in a shack that was barely standing. The place was a wreck, sagging roof, broken windows, yard full of refuse and empty bottles. Smoke rose from a crooked chimney, and a mange-ridden dog barked half-heartedly from the porch. Caleb dismounted and helped Lila down. She stood staring at the shack, her face pale and closed off. You don't have to do this, Caleb said quietly. Yes, I do. They walked to the door and Caleb knocked. For a long moment there was no answer. Then the door creaked open and Thomas Hart appeared. He was a thin man in his 40s with hollow eyes and a face mapped with broken veins. He looked at them blankly, then recognition dawned and his expression shifted to something between shame and anger. Lila, Pa. He looked at Caleb, his eyes narrowing. You're the one who took her. I'm the one who stopped her from being sold like cattle. Thomas's jaw worked, but he didn't argue. He stepped back from the door. You better come in. The inside of the shack was worse than the outside, filthy, cluttered, smelling of whiskey and neglect. Thomas cleared a chair for Lila and gestured for them to sit. Caleb remained standing, his hand resting on his gun belt. What do you want? Thomas asked. The truth, Lila said, her voice quiet but steady. I want you to tell the truth about what happened with Voss, how he forced you to sign that contract. Thomas laughed, a bitter, broken sound. Forced me? I signed it of my own free will. You signed it because you were desperate, because he knew you were desperate and he took advantage. I signed it because I didn't have a choice. The debt was real. The consequences were real. You had a choice, Caleb said, his voice hard. You could have said no. You could have found another way. There was no other way. Voss made sure of that. Thomas reached for a bottle on the table and took a long drink. You don't know what it's like being in debt to a man like that. He owns you, every thought, every breath. He lets you know that he can take everything you have, everything you are, and there's nothing you can do about it. So you gave him your daughter instead. Thomas flinched like he'd been struck. I thought he'd treat her well, that she'd have a better life than I could give her. You thought wrong. I know that now. Thomas looked at Lila, his eyes wet. I know what I did, and I'll live with it for the rest of my life. Lila stood, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. I don't want your guilt. I want you to make it right. There's going to be a review hearing in 2 weeks. If you testify, if you tell them how Voss manipulated you, threatened you, it could help. Thomas shook his head. If I testify against Voss, he'll destroy me. Whatever little I have left, he'll take it. He's already taken everything that mattered, Lila said, her voice breaking. What more can he take? Thomas looked down at the bottle in his hands, and for a long moment the shack was silent, except for the wind rattling the loose boards. I'm sorry, he said finally, but I can't help you. Lila turned and walked out, her back rigid, her head held high. Caleb followed, pausing at the door to look back at Thomas Hart. You're a coward, Caleb said quietly, and you'll die a coward. Thomas didn't answer. He just sat there with his bottle, staring at the floor. Outside, Lila was already on the horse, her face turned away. Caleb mounted behind her and they rode in silence back toward town. He could feel her trembling, could feel the grief and anger radiating off her in waves. When they reached the edge of town, she finally spoke. I hate him. I know. I hate that he's my father. I hate that his blood is in my veins. You're not him, Lila. You're nothing like him. How do you know? Because when it mattered, you fought. You didn't run, you didn't hide, you didn't give up. That's who you are. She was quiet for a moment, then nodded. What do we do now? We go back to Marsh. Tell him we struck out. See if he's found anything." They found the lawyer in his office, surrounded by papers and law books. He looked up as they entered, his face tired but determined. "Any luck?" he asked. "No," Caleb said. "Everyone's too scared to talk. Even her father won't help." Marsh sighed and sat back in his chair. "I was afraid of that. Voss has this town locked down tight. What about you? Did you find anything?" "Maybe. I've been digging through old court records, looking for other cases involving Voss. I found 3 instances where he sued for debt collection, and in each case the defendant lost their property or business. The pattern is there, but proving coercion is another matter. So we're nowhere. Not nowhere, but we're running out of time." Marsh stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street. "There might be one more option." "What's that?" "We make Voss the issue. Forget about proving individual coercion. Instead, we argue that the entire practice of debt bondage is unconstitutional, that no contract can legally bind a person into servitude regardless of the circumstances." Caleb frowned. "Will that work?" "It's risky. We'd be asking the review board to make a broad ruling that could affect a lot of existing contracts across the territory. But if we can convince them that the principle itself is wrong, they might rule in Lila's favor regardless of the specific details." "And if they don't?" Marsh met his eyes. "Then we lose, and Lila goes with Voss." Lila stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "Do it. Make the argument. I'd rather fight for what's right and lose than win on a technicality." Marsh looked at her with something like admiration. "You're braver than most adults I know. I'm just tired of being afraid." They spent the next week preparing. Marsh worked day and night, crafting arguments, citing precedents, building a case that would challenge the very foundation of contracts like the one Voss had forced. Caleb helped where he could, but mostly he just kept Lila safe, kept her fed, kept her spirits up. The night before they were scheduled to leave for the territorial capital, Sheriff Briggs came to the ranch. He looked grim. "We found Voss," he said without preamble. Caleb's heart kicked in his chest. "Where?" "He's holed up in a cabin about 20 miles north. Got 6 men with him, all armed." "Are you going to arrest him?" Briggs shook his head. "Can't. He's just outside my jurisdiction. I've notified the territorial marshal, but by the time they get there, he'll be gone again." "So he's just going to keep running?" "For now. But here's the thing. One of my deputies got close enough to overhear them talking. Voss knows about the review hearing, and he's planning something." "What kind of something?" "Don't know, but whatever it is, he's planning to do it before you get to the capital." Caleb's jaw tightened. "He's going to try to stop us from getting there." "That's my guess." "You'll be vulnerable on the road. Easy targets." "Then we'll take precautions." "I can send deputies with you, give you an escort." "How many can you spare?" 2, maybe 3. "That might not be enough." Briggs met his eyes. "I know, but it's all I've got." After the sheriff left, Caleb sat with Lila by the fire. She'd been quiet since hearing the news, her face thoughtful. "He's not going to let us get there, is he?" she asked. "He's going to try to stop us, but we're going to get there anyway." "How?" "We leave early, take a different route, move fast, and stay alert. And if he finds us anyway, then we fight." She nodded, accepting this. "I'm not afraid of him anymore, you know." "No?" "No, I'm angry. And anger is better than fear." Caleb looked at her, this girl who'd grown so much in so short a time, and felt something shift in his chest. Pride, maybe? Or hope? "Yes," he said quietly. "It is." They left before dawn, riding out under a sky full of stars. Marsh met them on the road with 2 of Briggs's deputies, and together they headed west toward the capital. The journey would take 3 days if they pushed hard, and Caleb intended to push. They rode through country that was beautiful and brutal. High plains and rocky canyons, pine forests and rushing rivers. The land was empty and vast, full of places where men could hide and wait. On the second day, they found the first sign of trouble. They were passing through a narrow canyon when Caleb spotted fresh tracks crossing the trail, 5 horses, moving parallel to their route. He called a halt and dismounted, examining the tracks closely. "How old?" Marsh asked. "Few hours, Maybe less. Caleb stood and scanned the canyon walls. They're following us. One of the deputies, a steady man named Williams, checked his rifle. Could be Voss's men. Probably are. What do we do? We keep moving, stay alert, and we don't stop until we're out of this canyon. They rode on, the tension thick as fog. Every shadow seemed threatening, every sound suspicious. Lila rode close to Caleb, her hand on the rifle he'd given her, her eyes scanning the rocks above. They were halfway through the canyon when the first shot rang out. It came from above, the bullet striking the ground just ahead of Caleb's horse. Dust reared and Caleb fought to control her as more shots followed, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. "Take cover!" William shouted, and they scattered, diving behind rocks and boulders as the ambush unfolded. Caleb pulled Lila down behind a large stone, covering her with his body as bullets whined overhead. He could see muzzle flashes on the canyon rim, at least 4 shooters, maybe more. "Stay down," he told Lila, then rose up and returned fire, his wounded shoulder screaming in protest. The fight was brief and brutal. The deputies and Marsh fought back hard, their rifles cracking in steady rhythm, forcing the attackers to keep their heads down. After a few minutes, the shooting stopped and they heard the sound of horses retreating. Caleb waited until he was sure they were gone, then stood slowly. Williams emerged from behind his cover, his face grim. "Everyone all right?" They checked. No one was hit, though it had been close. Marsh's horse had taken a bullet to the leg and had to be put down, forcing him to ride double with one of the deputies. "They were trying to slow us down," Caleb said, "not kill us." "Why?" Lila asked. "Because Voss wants you alive. Dead. You're no use to him." "So what now?" Caleb looked west toward the capital, still 2 days away. "Now we ride harder." They pushed through the rest of that day and all through the night, stopping only to rest the horses. By the time the sun rose on the 3rd day, they could see the territorial capital in the distance, a sprawling town of brick buildings and wide streets, the seat of law and government for hundreds of miles. They rode in exhausted and filthy, but they'd made it. And now, finally, they would have their chance to be heard. The territorial capital was a different world from Shepherd's Hollow. Where the frontier town had been all dust and wooden facades, this place was built of brick and stone, with proper streets and gaslights that burned even in daylight. People moved with purpose here, dressed in suits and fine dresses, their faces closed and businesslike. It was the kind of place where power lived, where decisions were made that shaped the lives of thousands who would never set foot inside its buildings. Caleb felt out of place the moment they rode in. His clothes were trail-worn and dusty, his shoulders still bandaged beneath his shirt, his face shadowed with exhaustion and 3 days of beard. Lila looked even smaller here, almost swallowed up by the scale of the buildings and the crowds. But she rode with her back straight and her chin up, and that was enough. They found lodging at a modest boarding house on the edge of town, 2 rooms side by side on the 2nd floor. The landlady, a stern woman with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, looked them over with obvious disapproval, but took their money without comment. The deputies took a room down the hall, positioning themselves where they could watch the stairs. Marsh had already gone ahead to the territorial offices to file their final briefs and confirm the hearing time. When he returned that evening, he looked tired but focused. "Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, he said, sitting down at the small table in Caleb's room. "The review board will hear arguments from both sides, then deliberate. We should have a decision by end of day." "Who's on the board?" Caleb asked. 3 territorial judges, Harrison, Blackwell, and Monroe. Harrison's fair but conservative. Blackwell's a progressive, sympathetic to reform. Monroe's unpredictable. He could go either way. "What are our chances?" Marsh hesitated. "If we can convince them that the principle of debt bondage is unconstitutional, we might win Blackwell, and maybe Monroe. But Voss's lawyers are good, and they'll argue strict interpretation of existing law. It's going to be close." Lila had been sitting by the window, looking out at the darkening street. Now she turned to face them. "What if we lose?" "Then we appeal to the federal courts," Marsh said. "But that could take months, maybe years. And in the meantime, I'd have to go with Voss." "Not if I can help it," Caleb said quietly. Marsh looked at him sharply. "Caleb, if you're thinking about running, I'm thinking about keeping her safe, whatever that takes. Running would make you a fugitive. They'd hunt you down. Let them try. Lila crossed to the table and put her hand on Caleb's arm. No, if we lose tomorrow, I won't let you throw your life away for me. You've already given too much. That's not your decision to make. Yes, it is. Her voice was firm, older than her years. You taught me to stand up for myself, to fight for what's right. If I run now, everything you've done means nothing. Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she was wrong, but the look in her eyes stopped him. She wasn't the broken girl he'd found in that barn anymore. She was someone who'd discovered her own strength, her own voice. And he had to respect that, even if it terrified him. All right, he said finally. We do this the right way. But if that board rules against you, we find another way. Legal or not, I'm not letting you go with him. Marsh stood, gathering his papers. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. Get some rest, both of you. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. After he left, Caleb and Lila sat in silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the city outside. Horses and wagons, distant voices, the clang of a trolley bell. It was strange how much noise a place could make and still feel empty. Are you scared? Lila asked. Yes. Me too. She looked down at her hands. I keep thinking about what happens if we win, where I'll go, what I'll do. You'll stay at the ranch, if you want to. For how long? As long as you need. And then? Caleb didn't have an answer for that. He'd been so focused on protecting her, on fighting Voss, that he hadn't thought much beyond survival. The future was a foreign country, unmapped and uncertain. I don't know, he admitted, but we'll figure it out together. She nodded and stood, moving toward the door to her own room. At the threshold, she paused and looked back. Thank you, Caleb, for everything. Get some sleep, Lila. You too. But sleep didn't come easily. Caleb lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind churning through every possible outcome. He thought about Voss, about the ambush in the canyon, about the cold calculation in the man's eyes. Men like that didn't accept defeat. Even if they won tomorrow, Voss would find another way to strike back. The fight might never truly be over. Sometime past midnight, he finally drifted off, his dreams troubled and dark. Morning came too quickly. Caleb woke to pale sunlight filtering through the thin curtains and the sound of the city stirring to life. His shoulder ached, a deep grinding pain that the laudanum only dulled, but he pushed it aside and dressed carefully, trying to look presentable despite his limited wardrobe. Lila emerged from her room wearing the same gray dress she'd worn to court before. Someone, probably the boarding house landlady, had cleaned and pressed it, and Lila had braided her hair with careful precision. She looked young and vulnerable, but there was steel in her eyes. They ate a quick breakfast of coffee and toast, neither of them having much appetite, then walked the 3 blocks to the territorial courthouse with Marsh and the deputies flanking them. The building was imposing, 3 stories of red brick with white columns and broad steps leading up to heavy oak doors. People streamed in and out, lawyers and clerks and petitioners, all caught up in the machinery of justice. Inside, the hallways were marble and echo, their footsteps clicking loudly as they made their way to the hearing room. It was smaller than Caleb had expected, more like a conference room than a courtroom, with a long table at one end for the judges and chairs arranged in rows for observers. A few people had already gathered, mostly lawyers and court officials, their faces showing only professional interest. Then Caleb saw Garrett Voss. He was seated at the front on the right side, flanked by 2 lawyers in expensive suits. He looked immaculate, hair combed, suit pressed, boots polished to a mirror shine. When he saw Caleb and Lila enter, his expression didn't change, but his eyes glittered with cold satisfaction. Caleb's hand drifted toward his gun belt, but Marsh caught his arm. Don't, the lawyer whispered. Not here, not now. Caleb forced himself to look away and took a seat on the left side of the room. Lila sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed straight ahead. She didn't look at Voss, didn't acknowledge his presence at all, and Caleb felt a surge of pride at her composure. At precisely 10 o'clock, the 3 judges entered through a side door. They were all older men, gray-haired and sober-faced, wearing black robes that gave them an air of ancient authority. They took their seats at the long table, and the room fell silent. Judge Harrison said, "This review board is convened to consider the appeal filed by Garrett Voss regarding the ruling of Judge Harold Carver in the matter of Lila Hart. We will hear arguments from both sides, after which we will deliberate and render a decision. Mr. Pemberton, you may proceed." One of Voss's lawyers stood, a tall man with silver hair and a voice like honey over gravel. He laid out his case with practiced precision, arguing that Judge Carver had overstepped his authority by invalidating a legal contract on moral grounds rather than legal precedent. He cited statutes and case law, building a wall of technical argument that made the whole thing sound reasonable, even inevitable. The contract in question was signed willingly by the child's legal guardian, Pemberton said. It was witnessed, notarized, and executed according to territorial law. While the board may find the circumstances distasteful, distaste is not grounds for nullification. The law must be applied consistently, or it ceases to have meaning. When he sat down, Marsh stood. He looked young and uncertain compared to Pemberton, but when he spoke, his voice was clear and passionate. "Your Honors, my colleague is correct that the law must be applied consistently, but he's wrong about what the law actually says. No statute in this territory explicitly permits the sale of human beings. The contract in question treats a 13-year-old child as property to be transferred like livestock. This isn't a question of interpreting existing law. It's a question of whether any contract, regardless of its technical validity, can be enforced when it violates fundamental human dignity." He paused, looking at each judge in turn. "Lila Hart is not property. She cannot be owned, cannot be sold, cannot be transferred from one person to another like a wagon or a horse. To enforce this contract is to say that desperate people can sign away their children's freedom, that debt trumps humanity. I ask this board to rule not just on the technicalities of contract law, but on the principles that should guide all law, that people have inherent worth, that children deserve protection, and that no signature can change those truths." The room was silent when he sat down. Judge Harrison made a note on the paper in front of him, then looked up. "Does either side wish to call witnesses?" Pemberton stood. "We do, Your Honor. We call Thomas Hart." Caleb's head snapped around, and he saw movement at the back of the room. Thomas Hart shuffled in, looking smaller and more broken than he had at his shack. He wouldn't meet anyone's eyes as he took the witness chair. Pemberton approached him with false sympathy. "Mr. Hart, you are Lila Hart's father, correct?" "Yes." "And you signed a contract with Mr. Voss, transferring guardianship of your daughter in exchange for debt forgiveness?" "Yes." "Were you coerced in any way to sign this contract?" Thomas hesitated, his eyes finally lifting to find Lila in the crowd. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Shame, maybe, or regret. Then it was gone. "No, I signed of my own free will." Lila made a small sound, quickly stifled. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Did Mr. Voss threaten you or force you in any way?" "No." "Thank you, Mr. Hart." Pemberton sat down, and Marsh stood for cross-examination. He approached Thomas carefully, like a man approaching a wounded animal. "Mr. Hart, when you signed this contract, did you believe you had any other options?" Thomas looked down. "No." "Why not?" "Because Voss owned my debt. He could have taken everything, the farm, the house, everything." "Did he tell you that?" "He didn't have to. Everyone knows how Voss operates." "So you felt you had no choice but to sign?" "Objection," Pemberton said, leading the witness. "Sustained," Judge Harrison said. Marsh tried another approach. "Mr. Hart, have you seen your daughter since you signed the contract?" "No." "Do you know what Mr. Voss intended to do with her?" No. He said he'd take care of her." "Did you ask what that meant?" Thomas's voice dropped to a whisper. "No." "Did you want to know?" "No." "Why not?" Thomas looked up, his face twisted with anguish. "Because I couldn't bear it. Because I knew if I thought about it too much, I wouldn't be able to go through with it. So I just signed, and I left her there." The courtroom was absolutely silent. "Do you regret that decision?" Marsh asked quietly. Thomas's eyes found Lila again, and this time they stayed there. Every day of my life. Then help us make it right. Tell these judges what really happened. Tell them how Voss manipulated you, how he used your desperation against you. For a long moment, Thomas didn't speak. Then he took a shaky breath and turned to face the judges. Voss came to me when I was at my lowest. My wife was dead, the farm was failing, I was drowning in debt. He offered to forgive everything if I'd sign over Lila. He said she'd have a better life, that she'd be cared for, that it was the best thing for everyone. But the way he looked at her, Thomas's voice broke. I knew it was wrong, but I was so scared, so desperate that I told myself it was the only way, and I signed. Did he threaten you? Not with words, but the threat was there, in his eyes, in the way he smiled. I knew that if I refused, he'd destroy me, so I chose to save myself and sacrifice my daughter instead. Thomas looked directly at Lila. I'm sorry. I know it doesn't change anything, but I'm sorry. Lila's face was wet with tears, but she didn't look away. Marsh nodded slowly. Thank you, Mr. Hart. No further questions. After Thomas left the stand, the judges conferred quietly among themselves. Then Judge Harrison spoke. This board will recess for 1 hour to deliberate. We will reconvene at noon with our decision. The judges filed out, and the room erupted in quiet conversation. Caleb turned to Lila, who sat motionless, staring at the empty witness chair. You all right? He asked. I don't know, she said. Part of me wants to hate him, but part of me just feels sorry for him. Both can be true. Is it enough? What he said? We'll know soon. The hour that followed was the longest of Caleb's life. They waited in the hallway, unable to sit still, unable to talk about anything that mattered. Marsh paced, reviewing his notes, muttering arguments under his breath. The deputies stood guard, watching Voss and his lawyers at the other end of the hall with hard eyes. Voss himself seemed unconcerned. He stood with his back against the wall, smoking a cigar, occasionally glancing at Lila with an expression that made Caleb's blood boil. Finally, a clerk emerged and announced that the board was ready. They filed back into the hearing room and took their seats. The judges entered, their faces giving nothing away. Judge Harrison arranged his papers, then looked up at the assembled crowd. This board has carefully considered the arguments presented and the testimony heard. The question before us is not simply whether a contract was legally executed, but whether such a contract can be enforced when it fundamentally contradicts the principles of human dignity and individual liberty upon which this territory was founded. He paused, and Caleb felt Lila's hand slip into his, small and cold. After thorough deliberation, this board finds that the contract signed by Thomas Hart constitutes an unconscionable agreement that violates public policy. While the document may bear the technical hallmarks of legality, it represents an attempt to commodify a human life, which this board cannot and will not sanction. Furthermore, the testimony provided today reveals a pattern of coercion and exploitation that undermines any claim of voluntary agreement. Caleb's heart was pounding so hard he could barely hear. Therefore, this board upholds the ruling of Judge Harold Carver. The contract is void and unenforceable. Lila Hart is not and has never been the property of Garrett Voss. Custody will remain with Caleb Rowan pending review by the Territorial Child Welfare Office, which we expect to formalize within 30 days. The gavel fell, and the sound echoed through the room like thunder. For a moment, no one moved. Then Lila turned to Caleb, her eyes wide with disbelief, and threw her arms around him. He held her carefully, mindful of his shoulder, feeling her shake with sobs of relief. Across the room, Voss stood frozen, his face white with rage. His lawyers were already gathering their papers, talking in low, urgent voices, but Voss wasn't listening. He was staring at Caleb with pure hatred, his hands clenched into fists. Caleb met his eyes steadily, and in that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. This battle was over, but the war might not be. Voss was the kind of man who held grudges, who never forgot a slight, but Caleb had faced worse men in worse situations, and he was still standing. Let him come, Caleb thought. Let him try. Voss turned abruptly and walked out of the room, his lawyers hurrying after him. The door slammed behind them, and the tension broke like a snapped wire. Marsh was grinning, shaking hands with the deputies. talking excitedly about the implications of the ruling. Lila pulled back from Caleb, wiping her eyes. "It's really over?" she asked. "It's really over. We won." "Yeah, we did." She laughed, a sound of pure, unbridled joy, and hugged him again. They left the territorial capital the next morning, riding out under a sky that was clear and blue for the first time in weeks. The journey home was easier than the journey there. The weight of uncertainty lifted from their shoulders. They took their time, stopping to rest the horses, sharing meals around campfires, talking about the future in ways they hadn't dared before. Lila talked about learning to read better, about maybe going to school someday, about all the things she wanted to do now that she was free to choose her own path. Caleb listened and encouraged her, seeing possibilities unfold that he'd never allowed himself to imagine. When they finally rode into the valley where the ranch sat nestled against the hills, Caleb felt something ease in his chest. The cabin looked the same, weathered and sturdy, smoke rising from the chimney where one of the deputies had kept the fire going. The barn, the fence line, the creek running clear and cold, all of it familiar, all of it home. Lila dismounted and stood in the yard, looking around with new eyes. "It looks different," she said. "How so?" "It looks like mine now, like I belong here." "You do belong here, for as long as you want." She smiled, and they set about unloading the horses and settling back into the rhythms of ranch life. The weeks that followed were quiet and productive. The Territorial Child Welfare Office sent a representative to inspect the ranch and interview both Caleb and Lila. The woman, a stern but fair-minded matron named Mrs. Whitmore, spent 2 days observing their living arrangements, asking questions, taking notes. When she left, she told them the formal approval would come within a month. True to her word, the letter arrived 4 weeks later, granting Caleb temporary guardianship with the option to formalize adoption if both parties agreed. Lila read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking, then looked up at Caleb with tears in her eyes. "Does this mean—" "It means you're safe. It means no one can take you away. Not Voss, not anyone." "What about adoption?" Caleb had been thinking about that question since the letter arrived. He'd never imagined himself as a father, had never wanted that kind of responsibility. But looking at Lila now, this fierce, brave girl who'd fought so hard for her own freedom, he realized that family wasn't always about blood. Sometimes it was about choice. "That's up to you," he said carefully. "I'm not trying to replace your father or pretend to be something I'm not. But if you want a home here, a real home, then I'm willing to make it official." Lila didn't answer with words. She just crossed to him and hugged him tight, and he understood. They filed the papers the following week. News of Garrett Voss came in pieces over the next few months. Sheriff Briggs reported that Voss had left the territory entirely. His business interests collapsing after several prominent citizens came forward with complaints now that his power was broken. Some said he'd gone to California, others to Mexico. No one knew for certain, and after a while, no one cared. He'd become just another cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked greed. Thomas Hart lingered for a few more months in his shack outside Shepherd's Hollow, drinking himself into oblivion. He died quietly one winter night, alone and unmourned. When Caleb told Lila, she cried, not for the father he'd been, but for the father he could have been. Then she dried her eyes and went back to work, carrying the weight of that grief in private ways. Spring came early that year, melting the snow and turning the hills green. Caleb taught Lila to brand cattle, to break horses, to read the weather in the clouds. She grew taller, stronger, more confident. Her laughter came easier, her nightmares less frequently. She was becoming the person she was always meant to be. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Lila asked the question she'd been holding since that first night in the barn. "Why did you help me? Really?" Caleb was quiet for a long time, watching the light fade from gold to purple to deep blue. "I spent a lot of years running from things," he said finally. "From my past, from responsibility, from connection. I told myself it was easier to be alone, safer. And then I found you in that barn, and I realized that running was just another kind of prison. So you helped me to help yourself." "Maybe. Or maybe I helped you because it was the first time in a long time that I saw something worth fighting for. something that mattered more than my own comfort or safety. Do you regret it? He looked at her, at this girl who'd become his daughter in every way that mattered, and shook his head. Not for a second. She smiled and leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together in the gathering dark, two people who'd found their way home through trial and hardship and the simple choice to keep going. The ranch prospered over the years. Caleb expanded the herd, built a new barn, repaired the fence line that had been sagging for too long. Lila grew into a young woman with her mother's dark eyes and her own hard-won strength. She learned everything Caleb could teach her about ranching. And then she taught herself more, reading books on animal husbandry and land management, corresponding with agricultural colleges. When she was 18, she told Caleb she wanted to go to school, to learn more than the ranch could teach her. He encouraged her, helped her apply, paid her tuition from savings he'd been setting aside. She left in the fall, riding off toward a future that was entirely her own to shape. But she came back every summer, and every time she did, Caleb was there waiting on the porch, coffee in hand, ready to hear about everything she'd learned and everywhere she'd been. And on the mantel above the fireplace, in a simple wooden frame, hung the letter from the territorial court, the one that declared Lila Hart a free person, not property, never property. It hung there as a reminder of what they'd fought for and what they'd won. A testament to the truth that real protection isn't loud or flashy or dramatic. It's just a man standing in a doorway saying no when the world expects him to look away. It's a girl finding her voice and refusing to be silenced. It's the choice, made every single day, to keep choosing what's right over what's easy. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it's the discovery that the family you choose can be stronger than the family you're born into, that love can grow in the hardest soil, and that redemption is always possible for those brave enough to reach for it. The story of Caleb Rowan and Lila Hart spread through the territory in the years that followed, told around campfires and in saloons, passed down from one generation to the next. Some versions made Caleb a hero, larger than life. Others focused on Lila's courage. But the truth, as always, was simpler and more complex than any story could capture. It was just two people who needed each other, who found each other at exactly the right moment, and who refused to let go when everything and everyone told them to. And in the end, that was enough, more than enough. It was everything.